It's complex and confusing. Is this a backdoor to taking over all the county's election systems and centralizing them under the state? I don't think we want that.
The initiative itself is about 16 pages long. If you're needing that many pages to be able to explain something, that right there is a red flag. It increases the chances of mistakes, with votes being up to 10 times more likely to be rejected due to improper marks. This complexity threatens the straightforward voting experience and may erode trust in election results.
It's just a total lie. They call it open primaries. That's not true. They say veterans can't vote. That's not true. They say this will make elections more fair and equitable. It's not true. And most supporters don't even know what it does. You talk to people who are putting out signs and you ask them, what do you think about ranked choice voting? What? They're lying to voters and they're lying to their own volunteers.
Welcome to everybody that came. So glad to see you here, and also, your interest in learning about Prop 1 and what it means for Idaho's elections. So, first speaker, we'll have Senator Tammy Nichols will be speaking and starting us off here.
Thank you. So I am Senator Tammy Nichols, and I am from District 10, which is I live in Middleton, but it takes in Middleton, Star, North Nampa, and some of the little outskirt areas. I grew up here in Boise, and I've lived in Middleton for about 22 years now. I have 5 children, and I'm a small business owner. I've been in the legislature for almost 6 years now. I spent 4 years over in the House and then 2 years in the Senate so far. And I'm also a precinct committeeman for my precinct in Canyon County. I currently serve on the Education and the Agriculture Committee as the vice chair. And I'm also the co-chair for the Idaho Freedom Caucus. And I got involved as a citizen, just like a lot of other people. Education is what got me started, and seeing what was happening in the education system, became involved in that, started going down to the Capitol and testifying and helping with bills, and decided that I was going to run for office because I thought there needed to be some changes in the direction of our state and things that were transpiring nationwide, that Idaho is not in a bubble, and that eventually things would get here as well for us to contend with. So I like a proactive approach, so I prefer to be proactive than reactive on things. So some of my legislation is things that I can see coming down the road that haven't made it here yet, but I know they're going to happen. So sometimes my bills seem to be a little bit outside of the normal circle or the square, but it's because I see things transpire. This is an important issue, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. They asked me to come speak and talk a little bit about the history to begin with of ranked choice voting, because this is a new thing, new concept here, right? And it's pretty new throughout the United States, really. But it's actually been around for quite some time. Some of the background with ranked choice voting is that it actually has origins from the late 19th century, emerging from a desire to promote a more democratic outcome and mitigate the limitations of winner-takes-all elections. Initially, it was proposed, though, in 1870, and ranked choice voting aimed to ensure that elected officials reflect a broader spectrum of voter preference rather than merely securing a plurality. The concept was developed by various reformers, including political scientist Robert Ware, who published the idea in the Harvard Law Review. The first government election utilizing ranked choice voting actually occurred in 1912 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where it was introduced to improve voter representation and reduce the impact of spoiler candidates. Over the following decades, ranked choice voting saw limited adoption, primarily in local elections, as it gained traction among progressive reformers who sought to address the shortcomings of the electoral system. But throughout the 20th century, interest in ranked choice voting grew, particularly during the electoral reforms of the 1960s and 70s, which aimed to increase voter participation and enhance democratic processes. In the 1900s and early 2000s, grassroots movements advocating for electoral reform began to champion ranked choice voting more vigorously, leading to key milestones such as implementation in San Francisco in 2004. The movement gained further momentum when Maine adopted ranked choice voting for statewide elections in 2016. Becoming the first state to do so. Many supporters of ranked choice voting advocate for replacing the Electoral College with a popular vote system, arguing that this would create a more direct and democratic electoral process. We see what's happening in Idaho, where it's not just about the electoral process, but it's really about just getting rid of the Republican primary. And that's really one of the targeted focuses with this. But by addressing issues like vote splitting and ensuring the winning candidates have broader appeal, ultimately, this movement seeks to reform the electoral system, take away party primaries, and to empower voters and create a political landscape that reflects the diverse opinions of the populace, fostering a more engaged and representative democracy, not a republic. So, what states have implemented ranked choice voting, and why are they now trying to get rid of it? Well, ranked choice voting is currently used statewide in Alaska and Maine, and in Hawaii for certain elections. Maine became the first state to adopt ranked choice voting for statewide elections through a voter referendum in 2016. The system is used for federal elections and for state offices. In 2020, Alaska adopted ranked choice voting for federal and state elections, including congressional races. The decision followed a similar voter-driven initiative, and that's one of the keys that we've seen in a lot of these is that it's a voter-driven initiative. Here in Idaho, the proposal is for it to impact over 20 plus elections. So it would be the most elections any state would adopt to use ranked choice voting. So currently 14 states contain localities that either use or are scheduled to begin using ranked choice voting in municipal elections, and 10 states have enacted legislation prohibiting the use of ranked choice voting in any elections. 5 states, Alaska, Idaho, Missouri, Nevada, and Oregon, have certified ballot measures for this November 5th related to either adopting, repealing, or preempting ranked choice voting. This is the most ranked choice voting related statewide ballot measures being featured in any a year. There is one potential citizen initiative pending signature verification in Colorado that could bring the total number this year to 6. There are also 2 ballot initiatives, one in Arizona and one in Montana, that could lead to the adoption of ranked choice voting in these states, depending on how the legislature chooses to implement the proposals if approved. Efforts to repeal ranked choice voting in various jurisdictions stem from several concerns. First and foremost, many voters find ranked choice voting confusing, as the process of ranking candidates instead of selecting just one can lead to misunderstandings about how votes are counted. This complexity can result in unintentional ballot errors, disenfranchising voters. Additionally, some critics question the transparency of the ranked choice voting counting process. Instances where election results have been contested raise doubts about the accuracy and fairness of the system, which can undermine public trust. There are also concerns about ranked choice voting's impact on election outcomes. Some political groups believe that the system may disadvantage their candidates, especially in races where third-party candidates could siphon votes from more established candidates. Furthermore, implementing ranked choice voting often incurs significant cost, including the need for new voting machines, additional training for election workers, and extensive public education campaigns. These expenses can be burdensome, particularly for jurisdictions facing budget constraints. Finally, public reception of ranked choice voting has been mixed. If voters feel the system complicates the electoral process without delivering the promised benefits, they may advocate for its repeal, like in Alaska. Collectively, these factors contribute to ongoing debates about the effectiveness and practicality of ranked choice voting in different regions. So one of the interesting things when you see these sorts of things come into states is who's really behind it. And right now, this is being pushed as a grass-led movement, but that's not necessarily the case. The effort to implement ranked choice voting in Idaho has been significantly influenced by groups locally like Reclaim Idaho, who brought us the costly Medicaid expansion, and Idahoans for Open Primaries, who led the signature gathering for Prop 1. While their messaging when gathering signatures focused on the idea of open primaries, a closer examination reveals that the underlying push was for ranked choice voting. Many voters have reported that signature gatherers, some of whom were paid, emphasized the notion of voting for free and fair elections without ever mentioning ranked choice voting directly. There's also a list of 114 former prominent Republicans that came out in September of last year supporting open primaries. The Idaho Education Association, also known as the Teachers Union, also is supporting Prop 1. We have out-of-state players also that have been working on this on a national scale. So it's important to recognize that ranked choice voting is part of a broader national agenda supported by various organizations including open primaries, which aims to enact open primaries across all 50 states. The National Popular Voter Interstate Compact, who is pushing to establish the use of ranked choice voting for presidential elections, with Maine being the 17th state to join the compact. The Capital Research Center has conducted extensive research on the influential players behind the ranked choice voting movement, revealing connections to prominent groups such as the Tides Foundation, the Murdochs, George Soros, Unite America, and the Rockefeller brothers. Additionally, activists with the Communist Party USA endorsed using ranked choice voting to elect more communist candidates to office and to oust conservatives, and even penned an op-ed in May of this year. These findings highlight the potential for external influences in shaping states' electoral landscapes, prompting concerns among conservatives about preserving the integrity of local decision-making in elections. We are seeing that with most of the money supporting ranked choice voting is coming from these out-of-state organizations. So why is this on the ballot this year? Why out of all years? In March of 2023, the Idaho legislature passed House Bill 179 that effectively banned ranked choice voting in the state. This legislation was driven by concerns among lawmakers regarding the potential complexities about voter confusion associated with ranked choice voting. The decision was supported by many Republican legislators who expressed the belief that ranked choice voting could undermine the traditional electoral process and create challenges in determining election outcomes. The ban came in response to growing discussions around electoral reform and initiatives like Proposition 1, which aimed to introduce ranked choice voting in Idaho. By prohibiting ranked choice voting, the legislature sought to maintain the existing primary and general election process, emphasizing the importance of straightforward voting methods that align with the values of most Idahoans. More states have banned ranked choice voting in 2024 than in any other year, with that push beginning just in 2022. So has the Prop 1 initiative been adequately explained to voters, and what has been left out? So you might have heard that a lot of people, as I said before, were being told that by signing the ballot initiative petition that this was going to be for free and fair elections and open primaries without saying anything about ranked choice voting. And even if you look on the signs, if you see the yes on Prop 1 signs, it says open primaries on there. There's nothing about ranked choice voting. But Proposition 1 does not restore open primaries. Instead, it would replace the current primary system with what's called a jungle primary, where multiple candidates compete to be among the top 4 advancing to the ranked choice voting general election. Before 2012, primary elections operated on an honor system, but problems arose when Democrats began losing to Republicans. Some Democrats requested Republican ballots to influence the primary, leading Republicans to restrict voting to registered party members, a decision that was upheld by the courts. Supporters of Prop 1 argue that restricting primary voting disenfranchises non-Republicans, but this claim is flawed. Voting is about making choices, including party affiliation, and anyone can register to vote in the Republican primary by simply checking a box. Additionally, jungle primaries could feature over 40 candidates, complicating voter decision-making and undermining the purpose of political parties to present a manageable number of options. Supporters also claim Prop 1 empowers voters, but party leaders may still pressure candidates to withdraw, reducing true voter choice. Ultimately, Prop 1 introduces a complicated and costly voting system that could erode public trust and an expensive solution to a non-existent problem. Voting no on jungle primaries and ranked choice voting is what most Republicans are recommending. What has been left out in the messaging that's been given by the pro-Prop 1 people? First is the complexity of the voting process. Ranked choice voting introduces a complicated system. The initiative itself is about 16 pages long. Most of you probably got that in the mail. Looks like this. If you're needing that many pages to be able to explain something, that right there is a red flag. It's a complicated system where voters rank candidates instead of selecting just one. This complexity can lead to confusion and mistakes, particularly for those unfamiliar with the process. Research indicates that a significant percentage of voters may not complete their rankings, reducing the effectiveness of their votes. Additionally, votes are up to 10 times more likely to be rejected due to improper marks. It also creates delayed election results. The tabulation process for ranked choice voting can be time-consuming as it involves multiple rounds of counting. When a candidate is dropped for not receiving enough votes, those votes are reallocated to the remaining candidates using computer algorithms. This could result in delays in announcing election results, which have been known to be weeks. And this frustrates voters and candidates alike. The cost of implementation. Implementing ranked choice voting requires a substantial financial investment in new voting technologies and systems. The estimates that they had were just like a few $100,000. That's what they were telling us on the pro side. But the Secretary of State for Idaho came out with a letter that said that the estimated cost could exceed $25 million to $40 million to replace existing equipment and train election officials. There's a strong likelihood that this would involve the acquisition of machines and software from companies like Dominion Voting Systems or Election Systems and Software, also ESS, which are frequently mentioned in discussions about modernizing voting infrastructure and have been known to play roles in election fraud and election issues. There's also the possibility of legal challenges. Ranked choice voting initiatives can invite legal disputes, particularly regarding how the new voting system interacts with existing laws. This could create uncertainty and instability in the electoral process as courts address these issues. There's potential for voter disenfranchisement. Ranked choice voting may disenfranchise certain groups of voters, particularly those who may struggle to understand the ranking process or whose votes may not count due to misrepresentation. Ballot exhaustion also comes into play. This occurs when a ballot is cast but doesn't count towards the end election result. This is caused when a voter undervotes, overvotes, or only ranks candidates that were already eliminated. There's impact on political parties. Ranked choice voting can significantly impact the dynamics within political parties, potentially diminishing their influence in the nomination process. Critics argue that this shift may result in candidates advancing to the general election who do not truly reflect the values of their respected parties. While proponents of ranked choice voting often assert that the system ensures elected officials have majority support from the electorate, evidence from election outcomes, like in Alaska and Maine, both of which have adopted ranked choice voting, suggests that this claim may not hold true. Instead, the results indicate that ranked choice voting can lead to outcomes that do not align with majority preferences. Legally, there was recently an article put out by Idaho attorney Art McAmmer analyzing what he found. And he said, basically in summary, that Proposition 1 had significant issues, including vagueness, complexity, and numerous typographical errors, raising concerns about its legality and potential for costly lawsuits. It seeks to repeal a 2023 law that prohibits ranked choice voting without clear public support, which makes the need for this initiative questionable. While marketed as an open primary initiative, it actually establishes two separate primaries and general elections, complicating the electoral process. This change could dilute the influence of political parties, as candidates from the top four primary would not be considered party nominees. Additionally, the definition of instant runoff voting raises concerns about vote reassignments to less favored candidates, further complicating the voting process. And remember, the Idaho Supreme Court has already ruled in the mid-2000s that primaries can be closed, and that was in Idaho Republican Party versus USERA, because they are private clubs. Implementing ranked choice voting in Idaho, if Proposition 1 passes, would involve several logistical challenges. This includes voting equipment. Existing voting machines would need to be replaced to support ranked choice voting, and again, the cost is ranging from approximately $25 to $40 million. This change would require new procurement processes and training for election officials. So do taxpayers really want to have to pay for that? I don't think right now they do. 2, election procedures. Ranked choice voting would necessitate new vote tabulation procedures, including multiple rounds of counting, which could delay election results. Clear protocols would need to be established for managing candidate eliminations and reallocating votes using algorithms. 3, voter education. A significant effort would be needed to educate voters about how ranked choice voting works, including public outreach and informational materials to ensure understanding of the new voting process. 4 is legal considerations. There may be legal challenges related to the implementation of ranked choice voting, particularly concerning the combination of referendum and initiatives. Addressing these issues would require careful planning. Candidate campaigns. Candidates would need to adjust their campaign strategies to fit the new electoral system, particularly in a jungle primary format where multiple candidates compete without party affiliation. And 6, administrative training. Election officials and poll workers would require training of the new system and procedures to ensure compliance and effectiveness for voter assistance. So voting no on Proposition 1 and ranked choice voting is crucial for Idaho's electoral integrity. Ranked choice voting complicates the voting process. It increases the chances of mistakes, with votes being up to 10 times more likely to be rejected due to improper marks. This complexity threatens the straightforward voting experience that Idahoans value and may erode trust in election results. Moreover, ranked choice voting could weaken political parties by allowing candidates who don't accurately represent party values to advance. There are concerns that this initiative is part of a broader push to both eliminate the Electoral College and the Republican primary, potentially shifting powers away from states like Idaho. Implementing ranked choice voting could also cost taxpayers, again, between $25 and $40 million to update voting machines and processes. So in summary, Prop 1 introduces unnecessary risk, complexities, and costs. And so by voting no, Idahoans can maintain a clear, fair, and trustworthy electoral process while protecting their voting rights. Thank you, and I will turn the time back over to you.
Thank you so much for explaining that. I didn't know, I don't know how many of you knew that it started in, I think, 1870 was when the first example of ranked choice. I also did not know about the Communist Party and that involvement and interest either. Cool, interesting facts there to understand about the origins and stuff. With that said, Brian, if you want to come up and explain then how it will affect Idaho, that'd be awesome.
My name is Brian Almon. I have my own platform. It's called the Gem State Chronicle. You can find my cards in the back, or if you're online watching, it's gemstatechronicle.com. I just do writing about politics and issues in Idaho mostly, because I think that's where we get the most bang for our buck. You turn on the news, it's all going to be Trump, Kamala, national stuff, and that is important to an extent, but we don't have the ability to influence it very much. You or me, we're not going to change the outcome of the presidential election, most likely. However, we can change the outcome of things here in Idaho, which is why I focus on our legislative races, county commissioner races, governor's races, and things like Proposition 1. A little bit about myself before I get into it. I moved here 6 years ago this month, not quite to the day. I'm a week off, but moved here from Washington, where I spent most of my life. I miss the rain and the mountains, but I don't miss the lockdowns and the taxes and the gun regulations. My wife and I live in Eagle. We have 5 children. The older 2 are in school. The younger one's doing homeschooling kindergarten at home, and the younger 2 are just playing and getting into things and making messes. We're happy to be here in Idaho. I wear many hats in addition to writing for the Gem State Chronicle. I am also the chairman of the District 14 Republican Party. That's Eagle and all of Gem County. And I also do little bits here and there for other organizations and people. But I've been following the Proposition 1 even before it was known as Proposition 1. It was a year and a half ago that Reclaim Idaho and several other like-minded organizations put their heads together and decided they wanted to completely upend and change the way we vote in Idaho. They put that initiative out. They fought the Attorney General in court because they wanted to call it open primaries. They wanted to pretend that was all what it was all about. And they've been fighting ever since. They got it on the ballot, and they're still lying to people and trying to fight it. I want to go into the background of how we have voted, because I think that's important context for understanding what they're trying to do here, why we vote the way we do, and why are they trying to change it. So you go back to ancient Greece. They had a republic, and that meant people had to vote. And oftentimes the way they voted, I saw this on a documentary once, is that they would take old pots that they had thrown out that were broken and break off little pieces and mark their vote on it and just put it in a basket somewhere, and then they'd count it up. Kudos to them for recycling. In early America, when you would go to your town hall or elect your representatives to the assembly or the legislature or the House of Burgesses or whatever it was called at the time, you would go in and you would announce publicly, I am voting for so-and-so. And, that kept people accountable, but you could be influenced. If your boss didn't like the way you voted, then it would make life troublesome for you. Or if your neighbor didn't like the way you voted. Eventually, they started going to a system where you had party-supplied ballots. If you were a Republican voter in Indiana, you would go and they would be at the polling place and give you a ballot that had all the Republican candidates, and then you would just literally take that ballot and put it in the box. It's very simple, very easy. You didn't really have much of a choice. If you wanted to vote for a Democrat on one race, you were out of luck. And that meant in some places where one party controlled everything, you might not have a choice at all. Famously, in the 1860 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln did not even appear on the ballot in the South because there was no Republican Party structure in the South. And so there was nobody to hand you that ballot. So you could go there and you could choose between the 3 Democrat candidates because they had split the party that year. But if you wanted to vote for Lincoln, you were out of luck and you were probably about to be run out of town. Eventually, they switched to something called the Australian ballot because they tried it first in Australia. And that's what we have today, where you have a ballot and has all the candidates and you get to choose which one you like. And that's a pretty straightforward way of doing it. There are different methods. In many places, you vote on a paper ballot. You physically fill out a little square or circle, just like when you're taking standardized tests in school. I voted early a couple of days ago at the Eagle Public Library, and it was a little square, a rectangle. You fill it in all the way with a pen, and then you run it through an optical scanner. And I think that's actually a pretty good system that we have here in Ada County. You still have the paper ballot. That's not destroyed. It's kept in a box, and it's supposed to be secure. Meanwhile, your actual vote is tabulated very quickly and then taken to the elections office where they count it up. I like the idea of hand counting, but when you have a dozen different races on each ballot, and especially ballots that are, say, one person's in Ada County Highway District 1 and others in Ada County Highway District 2, you're going to have different races on them. Hand counting is a bit of a pain. Optical machine counting, fine, but it's good to keep the ballots so that you can go back and audit it after the fact, especially if it's a really close election. There's also other systems where it's all on computer. I'm not as much a fan of that. Canyon County has one where you can do it on computer, but it then prints a ballot. That's another interesting way. So there's a lot of ways to vote is what I'm trying to get to here. We've tried a lot of things in our history, and this is really what we've settled on. This first past the post voting system. We go and vote for one person in a race, and the person with the most votes wins. It's very simple. Anyone can understand it. Children can understand it. It's not complex. What about primaries? The idea of a primary wasn't really on the minds of our original founding fathers when they made the Constitution, because they figured everybody would just come together and come up with the best choice. George Washington was elected by the Electoral College unanimously. Nobody bothered to challenge him. And then other people eventually would stand for election, and eventually that created factions. You had the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. Then you had the Whig Party, and people naturally coalesce into factions. In a system like Great Britain, where you have a parliament and you need a coalition, a majority coalition, you'll have different parties, but they'll often work together. In the American system, it's really designed for 2 parties. And you go back to the Constitution, and it's actually the 2-party system was inevitable the way it was set up. And so people are naturally going to do that. Instead of having factions of different parties coming together, like in England, where they joined forces, say, 2010, the Conservatives were just short of a majority, so they made a coalition, a deal with the Liberal Democrats, which is funny if you think about it. It was just enough to get them a majority. In America, we do our factions within the parties. In the Democrat Party, you have the Democrat Socialists and the different factions there. And the Republicans, you have the Liberty Republicans, conservatives, and then you have the moderates. And there's always been a tension there. But originally, go back to our founding, and they chose their presidential nominee for your party by having a congressional caucus. All their members of Congress of that party would get together and decide who they were going to nominate. Eventually, that turned into national conventions where they invited delegates from different parts of the country. And we still do that to an extent. They came up with the idea of caucuses, where you actually go as a voter and you spend a lot of time locked in a room deciding who you're going to support, who you as a neighborhood or a precinct or a district is going to support. Caucuses can last for hours because you will do multiple rounds of voting until you come up with a majority. Our presidential nominating caucus here in Idaho, we decided to do it a lot simpler. You just come in and cast your vote and move on. So you don't have to stay there all day, which is, most people thought that was a good idea. I think the idea of spending 12 hours in a caucus sounds like a lot of fun, but I'm not normal. And then there's also direct primaries. A lot of states have primaries. That's what we had in Idaho in 2012 and 2016, where if you want to nominate the president, you literally just go vote. You go cast your vote, and whoever gets the most gets all our delegates to the convention. In Idaho, we have been debating this for a long time. And it's really fascinating. Dr. Matthew May, he's a doctoral graduate from Boise State. His mother, Mary, is on our city council in Eagle. He wrote a really interesting dissertation on the history of elections in Idaho. And he was actually looking at the effects of the closed primary, which came after 2012. But to set the groundwork, he goes through the entire history. And I've referred back to it many times when I'm writing and talking to people. We got statehood in 1890. And for the first few years, we just had conventions. The Republican Party would have a convention. The Democrat Party would have a convention. They'd come up with their nominees for governor, for legislature through the convention process. In the 1906 Republican Party platform for Idaho, they supported a primary, not necessarily a direct primary, a closed primary. They worried that the Democrats would come over and raid the election, come in and vote in the Republican primary to either vote for the worst candidate, somebody who would have trouble winning in the general, or vote for the most moderate candidate, somebody they could stomach if that person did win. And it shows how things don't change. Republicans were worried about this over 100 years ago. Back in 1909, the legislature decided to create direct primaries, but they had a twist. It actually had ranked choice voting. In 1909, they passed a law saying that to nominate your nominee, you would vote for two. You'd rank one and rank a second. You'd put number one beside one candidate, number two beside another. And then whoever got the most votes would win. And they do that additional tabulation where if your candidate doesn't get enough votes, they would drop off and that person's second choice would be added, and keep doing that until you have a majority. It took Ada County apparently 8 days to count. And that was a long time back then when it was very small and you had a hand counting. And they decided that was a mess. So in 1911, they repealed that, didn't do it anymore. In 1913, the Republican legislature and a Republican governor, they combined to do a closed primary. And that's what we have now, where you have to be a member of a party to vote in that party's election. However, in 1918, there was a group of Republicans called the Nonpartisan League, and they decided they were going to go register as Democrats to mess with the Democrat nomination. See, but both sides do it. It reminded me of Rush Limbaugh in the 2008 Democrat primary, urging people to do what he called Operation Chaos, go in and vote either for Clinton or for Obama, depending on who was leading. And the idea was supposed to stretch it out so that they'd beat each other up and then they'd lose to the Republican, which obviously didn't happen. So because of that nonpartisan league playing around in the Democrat primary, they came back in 1919 and decided that you were going to have conventions. For statewide office, for governor, for lieutenant governor, for attorney general, you were going to nominate your nominee in a convention. However, for legislative offices, you could still do a closed primary. But then in 1939, they decided this closed primary thing, it's divisive, it keeps people from voting, we're going to open the primary. So they did open primaries. You notice we have this debate every generation, and we're just having it again now. 1962, they decided to close the primaries again. And so you had closed partisan primaries, and if your candidate didn't reach 50%, you would have a runoff. A runoff is where you have a second vote, where you take, say, the top two. Say you have 5 people running in one contest. They get everywhere from 10% to 40%. You knock off 3, keep the top 2, and then they just face each other it's like a final round. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. 1971, they switched back to open primaries. Back then, we had Governor Cecil Andrus, who was a Democrat. And the Democrat Party at the time actually wanted an official party registration system where you declared your affiliation with the party. And the Republicans opposed it at the time. But Governor Andrus vetoed that. And that's what we had until 2012. We had open primaries where any voter could go into the primary polling place, ask for any party's ballot. You could just go in and say, today I want a Democrat ballot, or a Republican ballot, or a Constitution Party ballot, Libertarian ballot. Or if you want, you can just vote on the unaffiliated ballot, which is school board races, levies, things like that. But the Republican Party at that time decided they didn't like this. They felt that Democrats were coming in and messing around in the primary, and so they as a party voted to close the primary. Government said, no, we can't do that. The law says it has to be open primaries. And so the Republican Party sued. Senator Nicholes mentioned that. It was the Republican Party versus Benny Sursa. He was the Secretary of State at the time, so he's representing the state in this. And they won a case saying that, no, freedom of association means that you have the right to close the primary. And that's where we are now, and that is what the backers of Proposition 1 are trying to use to get people to support a change. They're saying that, Idahoans voted in open primaries for 40 years until party insiders established closed primaries in 2011 to solidify their power. Sounds so ominous. And even if that's true, that has nothing to do with Proposition 1 because Proposition 1 is not going back to an open primary. Now, there are other alternative voting systems that have been tried throughout the years. This first past the post system where you come in and you vote for one person and whoever gets the most votes wins, that's very common in areas that are basically English speaking or used to be part of the British Empire because that was their system, and so we adopted that. And again, it creates incentives to make coalitions, whether in the British system with different parties or whether in the American system within two parties. It's not perfect. I don't think there is a perfect voting system because we're all imperfect people. And there's never going to be anything that takes into account every quirk of human nature and every loophole and every ability to game the system. But it works. It's simple. It's straightforward. Once the votes are counted, you know who won. Whether it's by 10,000 votes or whether it's by 2 votes, you know that the votes were tabulated and there's a winner. People have been debating different alternatives for a long time. Senator Nicholes talked about ranked choice voting came about almost 200 years ago, and mathematicians have been writing about it, trying to figure out the different outcomes. There's this great video by a YouTube channel called Veritasium, a fellow named Derek Mueller. He's actually Australian. He doesn't have any skin in this game. He looks at all the different systems and games out exactly why they are not perfect, because there's always loopholes. There's always ways you can game the system. If ranked choice voting passes, we will start gaming the system as Republicans. That's just the way it goes. The papal elections, electing Pope, for 4 centuries, they used something called a preference election, where you vote for everybody that you like. And then they just count up whoever has the most votes. Not really ranking because you're just giving everybody one vote. Imagine you go into the polling place and say, I like Donald Trump, I'll give him a vote. Harris, I guess so, give him a vote. Libertarian guy, he seems nice, I'll give him a vote. And then whoever has the most votes wins. It's an interesting idea. I want to say something, though. None of these systems are necessarily the moral choice. This really isn't a moral question. How you vote is not, it wasn't handed down by God from Mount Sinai on tablets saying, thou shalt vote with the first past the post system. It's not even in the Constitution. The Constitution does not specify how people in states vote. So if the founding fathers figured we'll leave that to the people of the states. Remember that our senators used to be appointed by state legislatures until the 17th Amendment changed that. How you select your leaders is not something that is necessarily a moral issue, but I would say that the backers of Prop 1 have been making it a moral issue. They're trying to say that if you don't support this, you are immoral because you are denying people the right to vote. And in America today, that's like the worst thing you could do, deny somebody the right to vote. And so they're using that. They're tugging on your heartstrings, trying to make you feel like if you oppose this, you're a bad person because you're not allowing people to vote. And that's not true at all. So this debate has been going on for a while, and why now? Senator Nicholes mentioned that we just passed a law a couple of years ago saying that ranked choice voting will be illegal in Idaho. I'm pretty sure during the debate, some people came up and said, why are you doing this now? This isn't a problem here. This is a solution in search of a problem. We need Idaho solutions for Idaho problems. Obviously, the people who sponsored this bill saw the writing on the wall. They were going to come here. They went to Maine. They went to Alaska. They've been changing election systems throughout the country. Washington and California both have a top 2 primary. They changed that in Washington before I moved out. So sometimes I had 2 Democrats to vote for. So this was coming, and our legislators saw that it was coming, and they took action. And so now we have this on our ballot because this is the other side striking back. But why now? More than 60% of registered voters in Idaho are Republican, which means 60% of registered voters have no problem voting on a Republican ballot in the primary. The last legislature was more than 80% Republican because there's no unaffiliated people in the legislature. You don't count those. When you get to the general election, you have to vote for a Republican or a Democrat. You can vote for an independent candidate, but usually they don't win because party name recognition is a thing. And trying to make it not is like Quixote tilting at the windmills. It's not really a thing that you can do. But I think the real reason they're coming after us now is because conservatives have been growing in strength in Idaho. 2 years ago, Dorothy Moon was elected the chair of the Idaho Republican Party. And that was a huge swing from where it was. It showed that the people who are most involved in party politics, the literal grassroots, were getting more conservative. And despite hundreds of thousands of dollars being spent to try and flip control of the party back by investing in PC races and sending out text messages to voters for precinct committeemen races, putting up signs, even billboards in some places, Dorothy Moon won re-election by an even greater share of the vote than in 2022, which shows that the conservative revolution in Idaho politics is here to stay. It's not just a flash in the pan. Over the past 2 primaries, a lot of legislators who are more moderate establishment types were defeated. Greg Cheney, Paul Amador, Jim Patrick, Jeff Agenbrod, Jim Woodward, although he'll be back next year. They were defeated by, in many cases, people who were not necessarily political champions. Brian Lenny over in District 13 just came out of nowhere and says, I don't like what my senator's doing, so I'm going to run against him, and I'm going to go talk directly to the people. And the people responded. Like Lenny Siderfeld out in Twin Falls, same thing. Going directly to the people and sharing a conservative message is a way to win because people get frustrated with their government. People get frustrated with what their lawmakers are doing, and yet oftentimes they feel like there's nothing they can do. And so when a conservative candidate comes along and says, support me and I will do what you want, I'll carry your message and your frustration to the Capitol, then oftentimes they win. And over the last 4 years, that's been happening a lot here. And that's got the powers that be and establishment very worried. The leftists and moderates, they're worried that conservatives are actually going to be able to make policy now, are actually going to be able to do what they say they want to do. And this Proposition 1 is, I think, an effort to stop that. Senator Nichols mentioned that a lot of the money is coming from out of state. Over the last few years, I think a lot of people have realized that the national battlefield is too big. There's too much money, there's too much power. We're not going to be able to move the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House of Representatives or the White House the way we want, but we can move state legislatures. And there's a lot of national organizations that have begun working toward that end on both sides. On the right, you have State Freedom Caucus and Young Americans for Liberty. On the left, you have organizations like Unite America, who have dumped hundreds of thousands of dollars into Prop 1 here because they see that Idaho is where the battlefield is. It's in states like this, states that we think are red states and always will be. It won't always will be if we fall asleep at the wheel. It's been growing more conservative over the past few years, but there are people both in the state and out of the state who want to change that. All that said, what is Prop 1? Senator Nichols gave you an overview, so I won't spend too much time on it. It eliminates the partisan primary and establishes ranked choice voting. Why do they want to eliminate the primary? It takes the Idaho Republican Party completely out of the equation. It allows Democrats and unaffiliated leftists to choose nominees. There's a lot of districts in Idaho that are solidly red. District 10. My district is District 14. Yeah, we're in no danger of having a Democrat win in these places, which is nice. And that means that the real fight is in the Republican primary. And they don't like that. The people supporting this initiative don't like that because they want to be able to manipulate the outcomes. On the other hand, there are blue districts too. Districts like District 16 right here in Boise, District 17, 18. It's very tough for a Republican to win here. Why are Democrats supporting it? Good question. This essentially eliminates third parties and independents, even though backers are trying to say that this would help third parties. This would help independents. Trying to say that this gives everybody an even chance, but that's not true, is it? If you've got the primary and you're going to take the top 4, do you think it's going to be Republican, Democrat, Constitution, Libertarian, Green Party, Socialist, Communist? No, it's going to be, if you're in District 10 or 14, it's going to be Republican, and maybe one Democrat, and vice versa in Boise. And honestly, if we already see this in Alaska, the party will adapt. In deep blue districts, the Democrats will talk to their people and make sure there's only one candidate. And Republican Party, I assume, will try and do the same thing. So it would really lock out the third parties. Right now, the 4 registered parties in Idaho politics, the Republicans, Democrats, Constitution, and Libertarians, they get to be on the general election ballot no matter what. The winner of the Republican primary, the winner of the Democrat primary, and the Constitution candidate, the Libertarian candidate, they all get to be on the general election ballot. Now, not all of them are. There are some places they don't file for that, but they have the right to be. That's according to our law. And then there's as many independents as file. Why did Ammon Bundy in 2022 step out of the Republican primary and run as an independent? Because that gives him 6 more months to campaign. Had he been in the Republican primary, he probably would have lost. I assume so. Maybe it would have been interesting. And then he would have been done. But by filing as an independent, he gets to be on the general election ballot. And one of the things that the backers of Prop 1 are saying is that independents are locked out of the primary. But that's not even the case because independents get a free pass to the general election. Of course, once you get there, party name recognition being what it is, it's very hard for an independent candidate to win, but this is not going to solve that. Instead of having, like I said, Republican, Democrat, Independent, and Libertarian, you're going to have 3 Republicans and a Democrat, or maybe even 4 Republicans. In Washington, like I said, where they switched over to a top 2 primary, oftentimes living in a blue district, I had a choice between Democrat A and Democrat B. So that's not really a great choice in the end. This would be a top 4 primary, so it's a little bit different, but I think the effect would be the same. That's primaries. That's what they want to change about the primary. And that's why I think there are unintended consequences that they're not telling their voters. Why change the general election? Their argument is that the winner sometimes doesn't get a majority. Ranked choice voting will help eliminate the spoiler effect, that where if you vote for a third-party candidate, it hurts the candidate you're closest to. And it'll make it so that you're sure that whoever wins has a majority support of all the voters in this district. Now, in certain races, we already have runoffs. In mayoral races, oftentimes there are runoffs. For example, in my hometown of Eagle last year, there were 4 candidates on the ballot. None of the candidates got a majority, and so they had a runoff. You had one more month to go out there. The top 2 candidates got one more month to go out there and convince voters to support me and not the opponent. And runoffs are, I don't think that they're a bad idea. They give people a chance to make one final pitch to the voters. Both candidates could look and say, okay, there's these candidates who voted for the 2 who are no longer on the ballot. There's these candidates these voters, who did not vote at all. All right, so we are going to go to those and make our pitches. And then a month later, you have one more election. The ranked choice voting is also called instant runoff because the idea is that it does it immediately. By ranking the candidates, it's just doing the whole runoff thing. The computer will tabulate it, and you don't have to worry about having a second election and having to pay for a second election and have campaign signs up for another month. And that might sound nice, but it eliminates that opportunity for candidates to focus, to reach out to voters who may not have participated or who may have voted for someone else. It takes that away. In political conventions, the Republican National Convention, Democrat National Convention, where they choose their presidential candidate, they use a runoff system. Nowadays, usually it's decided by the time they get to the convention, so all the candidates, all the delegates voted for Trump, and he's the nominee. Back in the old days, it wasn't always the case. I've been reading about the 1948 election over the last few days. It's really interesting. Go to gemstatechronicle.com and read one of my latest articles about that. And it's about why we should not take our foot off the gas because Thomas Dewey thought he had it in the bag. What they would do, and what they did in that election, is that on the very first ballot, you had Thomas Dewey was the front runner, but he didn't have a majority. And Robert Taft of Ohio, he was pretty close as well. But they had pretty much locked up their delegates, and they were fighting over these people who didn't like either of them. And they went back and forth. They did a second ballot, and still nobody has a majority. And eventually, Taft and the guy who was coming up in third place, they decided, okay, we don't like each other, but neither of us have the ability to win, so they dropped out, and Dewey ends up winning on the third ballot. But again, if you were in the room during these deliberations and debates as delegates are doing horse trading, trying to figure out how to get support, it happened in the 1976 Republican convention as well. The incumbent was Gerald Ford, but he hadn't ever won an election, so he didn't have a smooth sailing, and Ronald Reagan actually challenged him. And they went to the convention, and they weren't sure who would have the most delegates. In the end, Ford won, but again, there was a lot of horse trading in between. This instant runoff just eliminates the horse trading. It eliminates the chance for candidates to make their final pitch to voters. In fact, it incentivizes milquetoast candidates. Art McIntyre wrote an interesting article. I republished it on the Gem State Chronicle, where he explained how this works, because you don't want to take a tough stand on anything. You want to be everyone's second choice. You want to go and tell people that, I know you really like candidate A over here, but I know you hate this one over there. Why don't you consider me as your second choice? Vote for this candidate first and then put me as second. And you do that to enough people, and then you go over here to the same people that the first voters hate. Say, I know you don't really like that candidate over there. Vote for your candidate as your first choice, and then vote for me as your second choice. And then they are set up to be the winner. So it incentivizes people who are milquetoast and inoffensive and avoiding taking hard stands on anything. And then once they get in office, you don't know how they're going to vote because they haven't said so. They haven't taken a hard stand. I have a short video I want to share just because it's got some images on it. I put this together a year and a half ago during the initial debate over the initiative. And I use the example of the District 15 election, where we had several Republicans in the primary. And then in the general election, there was a Republican, a Democrat, and a Constitution Party candidate. Now, your first thought when you hear about Prop 1 is, hey, this will help the third party candidate. Not actually the case. So let's take a look.
In the primary, Cody Galloway defeated Fred Martin 53% to 41.2%, and that was great. Dorothy Green Zhang, a Republican activist, got 5.8%. In the general election, Galloway went on to face Rick Just, from the Democrats, and she fell just short. Sarah Clendenon of the Constitution Party got more than 400 votes, which was more than the margin between Just and Galloway. So you might think perhaps ranked choice voting could have helped, because surely the second choice of Constitution Party voters would be the Republican, not the Democrat. However, remember, this isn't just ranked choice voting. This is a top 4 primary and then ranked choice voting in the general. So I did a little math and I made some assumptions just for the sake of argument. In the May 2022 primary, Cody Galloway got 3,668 votes. And so she was the top vote getter, though she did not get an outright majority. I'm putting the top 4 candidates from the entire primary together here, because that's what it would have been like if we had the top 4 primary. Of course, had that been the rules, it would have changed behavior. So again, we have to assume some things just to make this thought experiment work. So these are your top 4. Notice that Sarah Clendenon is not even in the mix. She got 10 votes in the Constitution Party primary. So these are the 4 that would advance to the general election in November. Now what I did is I extrapolated using their percentages how much of the general election electorate would have voted for each candidate. Again, I completely understand that is an assumption. However, we have to work with what we have, in which case the percentages obviously work out the same. So under the ranked choice system, after the first round is tabulated, the lowest vote getter of the 4, if nobody gets an outright majority, is eliminated. Greenzang would be eliminated and her votes would be allocated to other candidates, assuming that her voters marked a second choice on their ballots. I don't know Dorothy Greenzang personally, but I've heard she's fairly conservative. So for the sake of argument, I assumed that for every 3 of her voters that went with Cody Galloway, 1 would go to Fred Martin. And that gives us these numbers. Galloway is still leading with 47%. She's very close to an outright majority, winning this race. Martin is in second, and Rick Just, I assume he doesn't get any of Dorothy Greenzang's votes. Again, elections are unpredictable. You never know what would actually happen, but this is just a thought experiment. However, here's the rub. What happens now that Rick Just is the 3rd one left, and he is eliminated for round 3? Where do you think the Democrats' votes go? To Cody Galloway or to Fred Martin? I think it's a good assumption that a vast majority of those votes will go to Martin, the moderate, the one who thought vaccine mandates were a good idea. In the Alaska Senate race, when the Democrat was eliminated for their 3rd round of ranked choice voting, 90% of those votes went to Lisa Murkowski, the moderate establishment Republican senator. I assume the same thing happens here. I assumed that 90% of Rick Just's votes go then to Fred Martin, and 10% go to Cody Galloway. And that leaves us with Fred Martin winning the ranked choice voting election with 51.1%. Now, the folks behind Reclaim Idaho and the whole Idahoans for Open Primaries coalition and the leftist Republicans and Democrats who are supporting this, they can do math as easily as I can. So I think this is probably a good estimation of what they're intending to do with this scheme. It is a moderate establishment protection scheme.
I remember in the oral arguments last year when the Attorney General challenged tried to put an accurate title on the initiative, and Reclaim Idaho challenged them to say, no, we want to call it open primaries. The lawyer for Reclaim Idaho and the Idahoans for Open Primaries said this out loud. They said, this has worked out great in Alaska because it's given us more moderate candidates, and we want the same thing here. So I think that's what it's about. Why should you vote no? If nothing's convinced you yet, why should you vote no? If everybody here is already going to vote no, that's great. I want to give you some things that you can take to your friends and your family and your neighbors. If there's anybody watching who's still on the fence, then I want to give you a good reason to reject this at the polls over the next 2.5 weeks. It's complex and confusing. I think that's a given at this point. Ranking, or first you go to the primary where you could have 40 people on the ballot and you have to pick one. That's going to be a mess. And then you go to the general, and instead of just picking one, you have to rank them 1 through 4. If you don't rank all 4, then your ballot could be thrown out. It could be exhausted. If the candidate you ranked number 1, say you go in and you only want one candidate, you dislike all the rest, you vote for that person. If that person is 4th place or 3rd place, they're knocked out, and then suddenly you don't have any vote. Your votes are not added to the tally. And they'll come out and say that so-and-so has won this election with a majority, with 51%. But that's not really true because it's not 51% of votes that were cast. 51% of votes, people who ranked all 4 candidates. And that might not be you. We've seen the results in other states. Senator Nicholes talked about what happened in Alaska. I think you know that. It incentivizes milquetoast choices. It moves Idaho leftward. It strikes back at the conservative revolution we've seen over the past couple of years and is going to move us toward a more moderate place. It's expensive. Could cost up to $40 million, said the Secretary of State. Problem is, and this is what Reclaim Idaho didn't account for, they looked at the way Alaska did it and said, it's only going to cost us about the same. Problem is, Alaska runs their elections from one place. Idaho has 44 counties, and each one runs their own elections in a different way. This would force all those counties, big counties like Ada and Canyon, as well as little counties like Camas County and Power County, to change the way they tabulate votes. And that could be very expensive. That cost is going to fall on taxpayers, especially in these smaller counties. And it's possible they might not even be able to do it, in which case, does that mean the state is going to have to take over the elections? Is this a backdoor to taking over all the county's election systems and centralizing them under the state? I don't think we want that. Jungle primaries eliminate the freedom of association. It eliminates your ability to be a part of an organization, such as the Republican Party of Idaho or the Democratic Party of Idaho. Parties aren't bad things. People talk about partisan politics as if it's bad. A party is just a group of people who have joined together to pool their resources to accomplish a shared goal. And yeah, we have our fights within the Republican Party, but then once those fights are done, once we figure everything out, once the primary voters have spoken, we move forward together. The Republicans, the GOP, the grand old party, it's the party of Abraham Lincoln and Calvin Coolidge, William Howard Taft, Robert Taft, the party of Thomas Dewey, party of Barry Goldwater, the party of Richard Nixon, the party of Reagan, Bush, and now Donald Trump. That's not a bad thing. The purpose of the primary is to select a nominee. It's to select your champion. It's like how the NFC championship game is to select the NFC's best team to go fight in the Super Bowl. Imagine if you get to the playoffs and you just reseed everybody, and every round you rearrange the seedings. There's no such thing as AFC or NFC. It doesn't matter. They're just words. They're just names. You're not really fighting to become the AFC champion or the NFC champion. That's the case here. They want to eliminate the parties and allow people to just say, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a whatever. A lot of people in Washington, where I used to live, since you could put your own affiliation on there, your own identification, they figured Republican was a bad word, so they put GOP or GOP party, which is repetitive. It's going to allow people to identify as Republicans who aren't even Republicans. It's like trans Republicans. Speaking of Republicans, the party is almost entirely united against this. They've pulled out a few high-profile people, former Governor Butch Otter, Jim Jones, I don't even think you can call him a Republican anymore, to be their standard bearers to say that this is bipartisan. But Dorothy Moon, Brent Regan, Tom Luna, Raul Labrador, Brad Little, Brian Lenny, Jim Guthrie, Scott Groh, Sean Digert, Mike Moyle, Chuck Winder, Jim Risch, Mike Crapo, Russ Fulcher, and Mike Simpson have all come out against this. There are very few things where you can get all those people on the same page. And if they're all on the same page saying this is a bad idea, I think we should listen and say, yeah, it's a bad idea. The only elected officials in the Republican Party who've come out in favor are people who lost their primaries by more than 1,000 votes. So basically sore losers who don't like the fact that the current system led to them being, ousted and want to change the rules. And that's really all this is. Even the Democrats who are supporting this, I think they're just doing it out of it's for short-term gain. It's to knock out the conservative movement in Idaho. Who cares what happens 10 years down the road? Another reason to vote against this is that the backers are lying to you. They're saying that voters can restore Idaho's voting traditions with Proposition 1 open primaries. It is not restoring anything. It is getting rid of the primaries, not going back to the way it was in 2010 with an open primary where you could go and select a partisan ballot. It's changing it to a jungle primary, a blanket primary where everybody's on the same ballot. You have to pick one, and then it goes to ranked choice votings, which of course they don't even say here. They don't even say anything about ranked choice voting on these things. Yet you open this up and massive. How many sections does this change in Idaho code? 42? It's crazy. I honestly believe a lot of people are going to be duped. They're going to think, oh, this is just open primaries. And they'll walk into the polling place and go get ready to vote yes. And then they're going to see on the ballot, it's literally 2 entire columns of information. They're going to read it and say, wait a second, this isn't what I've signed up for. This isn't what they said it was. Reclaim Idaho and their friends say that 300,000 voters are disenfranchised. In fact, it says here, allows all Idahoans, including 275,000 independents, to vote in taxpayer-funded elections. They can vote in elections. There's nothing stopping them. In fact, they've tried to lie and say that military members and veterans aren't allowed to affiliate as Republicans in order to get a Republican ballot. It's just a total lie. They call it open primaries. That's not true. They say veterans can't vote. That's not true. They say this will make elections more fair and equitable. It's not true. And most supporters don't even know what it does. You talk to people they're wearing the Yes on Prop 1 shirt and wearing the hat, and they're out there putting out signs, and you ask them, what do you think about ranked choice voting? What? They're lying to voters, and they're lying to their own volunteers. Can it be stopped if it passes? Heaven forbid. There are multiple ways you can stop it. More lawsuits. It's combining two issues in one initiative. That goes against our state constitution that says every law has to be a single issue. This is changing both the primary and the general. So far, the courts have not listened to that argument, but maybe if it passed, they would revisit it and say, okay, now you have standing to complain. Freedom of association. It says that you can identify as a Republican even if you're not affiliated as a Republican. The Republican Party is a private organization. The very title is a lie. It has nothing to do with open primaries. Are you allowed to just lie to voters completely and utterly? And if they vote for it, then so what? There's also the issue that our constitutionally legislatures set voting policies, not the people, not through the initiative process. Again, I'm not a lawyer. These are just things that other lawyers have said are issues with it. These are issues that the Attorney General's office brought up a year and a half ago and has been pounding the drum ever since. Even if it passes and then it survives court challenges, our legislature could still override it. There's nothing stopping our legislature from saying, no, we don't think this is a good idea, and they will vote against it. However, if they do, they will be hammered people will say they're ignoring the will of the people. Even if the legislature passes it, they'll start hammering the governor and say, you need to listen to the will of the people, veto this. And they're going to be under a lot of pressure. So instead of forcing our legislature to clean up the mess left over, let's just defeat this on November 5th. Let's say as the people of Idaho, this is a bad idea. We don't want it. And let's put this thing to bed. Thank you.